Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, football fans alike, it is your host back here with yet another top 10 rankings video for you guys. I put in the time, I put in the dedication, I put in the extra work to be able to present to you guys with some of the most exclusive content when it comes to draft evaluation all throughout the draft season and leading up to the NFL draft. And today, we're fixing to break down probably the most polarizing, probably the most, shall we say, probably by a lot of people's opinion and professional opinion, this is the most deepest class of skill position players in this year's NFL class, and that's none other than the pass catchers, the wide receivers, a quarterback's best friend. There's a lot of guys in this year's draft class which I think are really intriguing, very enticing, have a lot of high ceiling, and probably have the capability to probably take over the league within a year or two of being some of the most lethal, formidable outside opposing receivers in the league. And, of course, a lot of people share the same opinions about a lot of the guys as I do. And you know what? Without any further ado, I think without keeping you guys waiting or holding much longer, we better go ahead and get involved into it and, dive right into it. And, of course, as deep as receiving class is this year, I had to make myself some honorable mentions worth noting in this year's draft class, and I've chose two. I don't want to choose too many because that's, sort of spoiling the whole point of having a top 10. I think it sort of just devalues the intentions of having a top 10 and sort of, breaking down the guys who, sort of drew my eye and drew my attention as the most high-calibrated players. But I got two honorable mention players who I think were very noteworthy and worth mentioning, guys who I think could be really outstanding players. And really, one of these guys could ultimately be one of the biggest flops of the draft. But I think he's very noteworthy because he's gained a lot of notoriety through a lot of scouts and a lot of analysts' minds. But we'll get to him after this first guy. So the first guy I want to mention with my honorable mention is Jake Cowing, wide receiver out of Arizona. This guy probably, in terms of being just a true slot underneath possessional receiver, a guy who likes to run a lot of those intermediate routes, the meshes, the slants, anything just to be able to get it into the guy's hands and be able to let him do the rest with it and just be able to rack up those catches year in and year out. The guy had a lot of productivity at his time at Arizona. Obviously, Arizona really didn't have much of a reputation across the Pac-12 for several seasons, all the way up until last year in its final year of existence. And Arizona was able to piece together a pretty great season. And I think Jacob Cowing's one of the more underappreciated playmakers in all of college football for at least the past 2 or 3 years. He's probably the best slot receiver when it comes to the short intermediate receiving game, probably right there with some of the best receivers in this class in terms of that true underneath ability at catching balls underneath in the mesh and the slant route patterns, as we had mentioned. And then I think at the combine, I think he really blew a lot of doors down when he came in there. And I know for sure he blew mine down when he came through and ran a 4.38 40 time and really was just some showcasing that this guy, a lot like a lot of these slot receivers in today's game are really fast, are very capable. We've seen a lot of highly valuable slot receivers come out, were just guys who are drafted to organizations who are looked upon as, solidifying that slot role and being a guy that people and, coaches can look to and, be a quarterback's check down target. And I think it's a very underrated, disvalued position. I think Jacob Cowing here from Arizona probably takes the crown in terms of being the best true slot receiver in this year's class. And it's definitely a huge benefit that he's got such tremendous speed up his sleeves. Another guy I want to get mentioned in my honorable mentions is the guy, like I said, probably the ultimate boomer bust player in this year's crop of guys. I think unanimously and undisputedly is that none other than Keon Coleman of Florida State. He's got it written all over him. A lot of scouts love this kid. I think because of his size, his height, weight, ability to be able to bring down a lot of contested balls and win 1v1 catches against maybe some of your smaller defensive backs. He can just be able to just lunge over these guys and be able to use his size advantage to be able to make a lunging grab, so say. But when I look at Keon Coleman, not only one thing that screams to me and sort of just to many others is that 40-yard dash of a 4.62, I believe was the second slowest combine 40 time of any of the wide receivers in this year's crop. And a lot of people look at this guy and tell me that he's a top 5 receiver, that he's a late first-round guy. He should be right there in the conversation with all the elites in this year's class. So I don't really see it. I really don't buy into the hype. In fact, his teammate Johnny Wilson over there at Florida State, who, spoiler alert, I got higher on this list. I didn't really see too much indifferences to the two guys' game. Of course, Keon Coleman transferred over from Michigan State, sort of became the alpha pass catcher over there at Florida State this past season. But I just never really saw a lot of elite route running skills of Keon Coleman. Now, maybe, there was something that other people saw that I didn't, but yes, indeed. I think the most envious thing out of this guy's game is his height, weight ability, his ability to be able to win the contested balls, as we had mentioned. But when you want to look to true downfield speed, he very much lacks it. He lacks route running skill set. And when you really turn on the film, when you turn on the tape, and you do a lot of film study on this guy, you could sort of see that he's a little bit rusty. He's a little bit stiff. He doesn't really have the most incredible get off at the line of scrimmage. He was a huge contribution to Florida State's football team, but so was so many other players on that team to their incredible ACC championship season. But I see boom or bust. I can really, honestly, if this guy gets into the league and he's drafted incredibly high and the expectations are what they are, if he ends up going in the first round, I can totally see this guy flopping and not really panning out at the next level. Or, you get him to a scheme where they can find a role for him where he can use his height advantage and be able to win maybe against safeties or win against, the coverage of linebackers perhaps. I could see this guy doing it, but I can't really see him winning a whole lot 1v1 with some of the more elite corners in the game. So I don't really see this guy really translating over into the NFL. Now, I'm putting him as an honorable mention. I still think he's probably got a day 2, third round grade. I don't really see the first round or anything. I can't put him in the same distinction as so many of these other guys. And like I said, boom or bust label is pretty indicative of his game. So those are the two receivers I wanted to get out of the way and mention before we reveal the top 10. And, like I said, Cowing, really great slot receiver, and Keon Coleman, the most epitomization, like I said, very indicative of what it is of a boom or bust player. All right, so before we get involved within the top 10 of my draft, I just want to be able to make a point of expressing and not downplaying the fact that, so many connected bloodlines to the NFL are all scattered out throughout this NFL draft process. You can mention anything from the likeness of, of course, Marvin Harrison Jr., who I think comes to most people's minds. Of course, elite NFL running back Frank Gore, his offspring, Frank Gore Jr., formerly of Southern Miss, also in this year's draft class. And not even ceasing to mention also Jeremiah Trotter Jr., the linebacker from Clemson, whose father was formerly Jeremiah Trotter of the Philadelphia Eagles in the early 2000s when they had their success. But this all comes and sort of ties in to our number 10 player in this year's NFL draft, and he does have connected bloodlines, maybe debatably the most strongest bloodlines you could have of any player to ever come out in an NFL draft. And you probably pretty much know who it is. Well, it's Jerry Rice's son. It is Brendan Rice, wide receiver from USC, coming in as my number 10 receiver in this year's draft class of wide receivers and the massive haul of guys we got. Of course, when you talk Brendan Rice, of course, you got to talk that Caleb Williams was his quarterback. The guy that was distributing the football to him was perhaps, like we said, the greatest player in this year's draft class. Of course, he really didn't get a whole lot of involvement in the 22 campaign, but the 2023 season obviously is when Brendan Rice sort of came into his own form. Now, when you play at USC, you're sort of under the shadow, and you're sort of a very incredible depth chart ahead of you, and you really got to do absolutely everything in your willpower to be able to compete with so many guys, that they bring in and year out, 4 or 5-star receivers. And Brendan Rice, obviously, I think something to do with the fact that, hey, this is Jerry Rice's son. Maybe we should be able to find some, production out of this kid. Well, they did, honestly. And Brendan Rice, if you really want to know the truth to it, in just a small sample size, was able to prove to me that he is a very more than capable wide receiver, very high ceiling wide receiver. Not even just the fact that his dad is the greatest receiver possibly of all time, but Brendan Rice, I think in just one season at USC, sort of showcased it. Showed some pretty mediocre route running skills, like I said, just very small sample size of what his ability can be. I do question a little bit of his ability to be able to win 1v1 matchups against press coverage and against some, tight zone coverage as well. Just, talking about his hands. I don't really know if his hands are quite like his father's, but I think this guy's got some very, very underrated vertical ability at the next level. Do not downplay this kid's vertical skills. I think he can be a guy that teams can send on the fly route and be able to win matchups down the field when he disadvantages teams down the field. Of course, he ran a 4.5 flat. Now, of course, 4.5 flat isn't what it used to be at probably 10 years ago when the receiver runs into 4.5s. That's pretty average NFL speed nowadays. Is pretty much you run into 4.5s. That's some alarming to some teams, and they sort of question if you can mold and develop yourself into a number one pass catcher in the league. But I do not underestimate this young man's ability to be able to win 1v1 matchups. And just the small examples of what we were able to see this last season. And, of course, do not ever underestimate bloodlines, man. I mean, of course, we'll talk about another guy with some really strong bloodlines who you could only imagine would be pretty high in this list. But I think it was very notable to mention Brendan Rice. I think he's got upside ability to be a vertical receiver, probably a complimentary guy at the next level if you just want to know the truth to it. And I think the 4.5 speed pretty much spoke itself into existence. But Brendan Rice, definitely a very notable wide receiver. Yeah, I think he was definitely worth the top 10. Now, of course, some people could dispute it. Some people could say that other guys are worth mentioning because there's so many wide receivers, right? It's really hard to pick between even 10, honestly. You could have made a top 20 list when it comes to these guys. And, of course, you can ask me for my thoughts and opinions on any player that you would love to know about. But I have Brendan Rice as top 10. Yeah, look, I don't underestimate bloodlines at all, man. That's one thing you just cannot downplay. And I do think he can be quite the player and really sort of cut into his own sort of legacy in the NFL himself. Coming in at my number 9 position is a guy that we had just mentioned, a teammate of, and that is Johnny Wilson over there at Florida State. Johnny Wilson has always been the guy through and through. Now, I know Keon Coleman had the breakout season. He's been receiving a lot. We already talked about his boom or bust potential in the NFL, and I think he's a major red flag to a lot of people, and a lot of people, like we said, we could possibly help him translate in the NFL. But I think surefire wide receiver has always been Johnny Wilson. I think he's got some pretty solid underneath route running skills. Now, he's totally what you would call and label as a possessional wide receiver. Okay, he's a hands guy, right? He can make the clean catches. He does, he's very selective with the route running tree. But, curl routes, like we said, the check down, intermediate stuff, short post routes. I mean, this is sort of what Florida State was enabled to get this guy involved with. And not to mention, man, Florida State is a really big proponent of huge physical wide receivers. And really, Johnny Wilson is no exception. I think this guy sits at 6'7". He's a huge specimen of a man right here. And he really does have some of the more finest hands in this year's draft class. I mean, he's almost sort of an automatic check down receiver. And his athletic profile is obviously something else that has a lot to do with how highly touted we are of the young man. Yeah, he's just one of those kind of guys that I think is very synonymous to what you could mention with that of Keon Coleman. But obviously, he's a lot faster than Keon Coleman. He's a 4.53 guy, like I said. Not the most elite, but when you compare it, it doesn't stack apples for apples with a guy that ran into 4.6s. And pretty much what it ultimately came down with me was I was looking at both receivers, and I was almost more or less comparing Johnny Wilson to Keon Coleman because I definitely envision and value both guys as guys who are fringe top 10 receivers. And pretty much, you go back and you watch tape, you go back and, obviously you channel in that combine performance and you sort of add all these things into proportion, I just saw that Johnny Wilson was the more complete, put together wide receiver through and through. And obviously, I thought both dudes were definitely deserving possibly of the top 10. So ultimately, I chose between Johnny Wilson, and he ends up notching in at my number 9 spot on the list. So, yeah, I think he could be a very interesting product at the next level. Maybe he's a slot receiver. Maybe some teams could utilize him as their complementary weapon. Like you said, the lack of route running skills, besides the short intermediate stuff and using his height frame advantage could sort of come into proportion when it comes to his success going forward in the NFL. But I definitely think he's definitely noteworthy enough of top 10 conversation. All right, moving forward into the number 8 guy. And like I said, with this draft class, there's a lot of dudes who played at same schools and have sort of been players, to play opposite of guys, sort of in that complementary role. And that's none other than Brian Thomas Jr. from LSU. Now, spoiler, my number 8, my number 7 guy, the guy that's going to be right above him, could honestly flip-flop in between. But we're going to go with Brian Thomas here at number 8. And really nothing against Brian Thomas Jr. I was really, sort of dazzled and really floored by how much he sort of developed and molded his game to the next level and really took it up a notch, within just sort of 2 years at LSU at sort of being that complimentary, depth wide receiver and ultimately emerging himself as one of the most lethal complimentary pass catchers in all of college football. And yeah, you're talking about a guy who, when Jayden Daniels was processing the middle of the field as effectively as he did throughout this season, this was the guy that he was scanning the progressions and finding most of the time, controlling that middle of the field, been able to fling open on the post patterns, been able to fling open, on the crossing routes. It's always was Brian Thomas Jr. freeing open down the field. And, that obviously was a true factor to that LSU offense that was so lethal this past season, not just Jayden Daniels and, Malik Neighbors, who was over, Brian Thomas as the number 1 guy there. And also Brian Thomas Jr. is another guy. Do not underestimate his contested catchability as well. And he showcased a lot of that, through his time at LSU. I do think there's sort of a lack of true perimeter skills to his game. Reason of which being I don't think he's that very polarizing as a prospect. I think at most he's just once more he's going to be a complimentary receiver at the next level, sort of complimenting whoever it is that he gets drafted by and being that number 2 option. But the most intriguing thing that you must not cease mention when it comes to Brian Thomas Jr. was another thing that blew a lot of doors down at the combine, and this guy is an absolute blazer. 4.34 40 time at the combine for Brian Thomas Jr. was absolutely impeccable. And that's one reason why I sort of came to the idea that I could almost debate who the better and I think Brian Thomas is right there in that conversation to who the best complimentary receiver is in this year's crop of guys. And I think Brian Thomas Jr. could definitely get arguments for that. But of course, you could also say, some of the knocks against the guy. Well, he only really had 1 year of productivity, or, you could say the hot rifling hand of college football, Jayden Daniels, was distributing the football to him. Of course, he's going to be able to put up big-time productivity. No, I do believe this guy is one of the more, high polarizing, high ceiling players when it comes to this year's NFL draft. And I think the 40 time when you run into 4.3s, when you show that you can control the middle of the field and be a really effective perimeter wide receiver opposite of a guy in a complementary role, I think it definitely shows that you got a lot of capability in the league. I think he's a second-round guy. I really don't look to guys who are predominantly complimentary dudes in the college rankings as first-round guys. Now, every now and then you get some rare exceptions. He reminds me a whole lot of Terrence Marshall, who came out of LSU a few years ago, but he hasn't really got it going in the Carolina Panthers yet. So, but I think, debatably, he's a better version of Terrence Marshall. He's much more faster than Terrence Marshall. So, Brian Thomas is definitely debatably the best complimentary pass catcher in the class. Now, my number 7 guy was another guy who was a complimentary to, yet again, one of the more elite wide receiving corps in all of college football, and that was Jaylen Pul over there at Washington, who was the opposite of Rome Odunze in that elite Pac-12 championship Washington Huskies football team, which was so incredible this past season. And what a year they had, and what a year that, it was to be a Washington Huskies fan out there on the West Coast, obviously. But, yeah, look, man, Jaylen Pul, absolutely incredible player. Just once more, another really good complimentary wide receiver who can control the middle of the field really well, who can really, free himself open when, maybe Rome Odunze was getting double teamed, and, that second progressional option for Michael Penix Jr. to be able to scan and find open down the field. There's a lot of things I really like about Jaylen Pul, and it's really a lot of things on the film analysis of Jaylen Pul is his hands ability. This guy's got some really sensational set of hands, just like some other guys we had mentioned earlier. And to me, you can sort of attribute that to why we chose Jaylen Pul over Brian Thomas. I think he can win more contested balls. He's proven he can win more contested balls. He's proven on film that he can be much more of an explosive wide receiver in that complementary role, and show that maybe his promise is maybe ascending and emerging himself into higher territory is quite possible. Now, of course, I think one thing that sort of derailed the stock a little bit was the 4.52 40 at the combine. Maybe not as jaw-dropping as Brian Thomas, who was exceptionally faster. And, of course, you could also say Brian Thomas Jr. played up against more elite competition. Now, I'm not so sold on that, because Pac-12 just came off probably its greatest season ever in its final season. But Jaylen Pul is very incredible. I'm telling you, he's a really sensational playmaker, really good set of hands. I think, just his hands ability, he's made so many jaw-dropping catches through his time at Washington, and he just made that Washington offense even more just more powerful than they could possibly have imagined that they were going to be able to have this past season. So Jaylen Pul, Brian Thomas Jr. definitely defining complementary receivers at the next level, and that's why they crack in at my number 8 and my number 7 spot on my top 10 list. Now, of course, advancing on to my number 6 wide receiver is a guy that really hasn't quite had the offseason that he would desirably want to, and another dude who really just didn't really run the most effective 40, but I think it proves that the 40 time just doesn't really define a player's greatness, and that's Javon Baker from UCF. Reminds me a lot of how I looked at Josh Downs coming out of UNC last year as sort of just that project, build me into a great wide receiver at the next level kind of player. Of course, he was the alpha pass catcher at UCF for 2 consecutive years, and of course they make the move to the Big 12, and he ended up leading the Big 12 in receiving yards last year, which I think was very noteworthy considering the wide receivers that come in and out of that conference, which, by the way, also features Xavier Worthy and A.D. Mitchell over there at Texas, who, at some point I would have to mention in this video at some given point. But Javon Baker, I just, a lot of people just sort of say, well, 40-time combine performance really wasn't that great. What is it that you really envision about this young man, and what is it that you really like about his game? Well, I'm going to tell you exactly what it is about Javon Baker, is that I think he's got, like I said, he's another young guy that has really polarizing ability. Now, I think his hands, he has some of the more spectacular grabs worth mentioning, just like Polk, some guys with some really good set of hands who can win 1v1 matchups, who can win against a corner or a defensive back and be able to, just out-advantage those guys on the outside perimeter. A guy that's got some pretty mediocre route running skills, but maybe nothing incredible, obviously. But I tell you, this guy, Javon Baker, definitely has got a lot of capability to his game. And, of course, like I say, you really can't hold him accountable for the 4.54 sort of underwhelming combine performance. Like I said, on film, I really never saw too much jaw-dropping plays out of him, but I think his hands are some of the best in the class. Like, I think when you want to talk about a guy who can just really make some, circus grabs, just like some of the more elite, like sort of like how Marvin Harrison Jr. was able to use his height ability to be able to win 1v1 matchups and be able to make spectacular grabs. I think Javon Baker sort of has just about as good a set of hands as those guys. And I think he's a guy that you can really sort of take under the wing, sort of be a guy that you can mold and develop, get the right coaching, and, he could possibly launch his potential at the next level and do great things. And I remember talking about Josh Downs last year, a guy that came out of UNC who was, not really the most polarizing player as well, not really, a guy with the most elite attributes and intangibles, but, he ended up having some sort of, effective role in the Colts offense last year. So I think Javon Baker is very synonymous when it comes to that. I think he could be a guy with that sort of same kind of capability and that same sort of, label tag on him. I like a lot of what he brings to the table. Like I said, don't underestimate. He led the Big 12 in receiving yards last year in a very stacked, heavy conference. So he's very noteworthy. I got a third-round grade on him. Second-round grade. I think I'm gonna stay with a second-round grade on this guy. He, like I said, right coaching at the next level. I mean, some of the best coaches in the business come out of the National Football League and have made stars that maybe not a lot of people saw, coming. So Javon Baker could definitely be one of those guys, or definitely be a guy to keep on a lot of teams' radar. And then coming in at my number 5, we're getting within the top 5 of guys already by now. And this dude, I'm telling you, okay, I absolutely love the potential of this young man, and that's Devante Walker from North Carolina. Of course, everybody, who keeps up very adamantly with college football knows this guy was a transfer wide receiver coming into the North Carolina program, was determined and was set to become their number 1 alpha pass catcher in their offense this past season. Of course, they didn't grant him eligibility. There was a whole entire huge dispute about it. The whole entire North Carolina coaching staff was really, disgruntled and, up in arms about it. But eventually they let the young man play. And it came about to the midway point in the season, and then, of course, Drake May was very stoked and excited about it. He finally got a guy that he can rely on in the outside perimeter on a consistent basis. And they let this young man play. Boy, when they let this guy play, he absolutely went off in certain games. And you could look to some of the games that he absolutely torched defenses. He was a real spark to the fire for that North Carolina offense when he finally was granted the ability to play. He absolutely balled out. Now, I'll tell you, a very enticing matchup to look out for on film, if you're really one of those film scholars like myself, was Devante Walker versus Nate Wiggins. That was a absolute barn burner of a matchup with those two guys going head-to-head on the outside perimeter. Of course, I just think this guy, the ceiling, the potential of this guy is out of the roof, okay? Now, you probably could be wondering, well, why are you going to have him over guys like Brian Thomas Jr., or why are you going to have him over guys like, the Florida State wide receivers who put together and piece together much more complete tape? Well, and of course, you could also say, why are you going to put them over the Texas wide receivers? I'll tell you this, okay? When you evaluate players, one of the biggest tricks as a GM, obviously, not me, but as just a fan and a scouting nerd or a buff like myself, is sometimes you got to think, it's just like we applied when we talked about Javon Baker. You got to apply the metrics of what the ceiling and what the potential can be. You get a guy like Devante Walker who didn't necessarily play a whole lot of games in college football. Hold that into account, but when he did play, how much of a contribution did he leave? I think this kid left a huge contribution on that North Carolina football team, and he really just was an absolute explosive playmaker when he played. Now, of course, you're going to look back and you're just going to look at the stats and say, well, not enough production. Well, you got to think what the time was when he was able to produce and what the upside can be, okay? And by the way, if you were not sold on it, which I'm not sure a lot of people were, when he showed up at the combine, he absolutely just tore up that 40-yard dash. He probably left, tire marks at the very end. He ran a really incredible 4.36 40 time and actually posted one of the best vertical jumps, going 40 inches at the combine. That's about as good as a lot of these other wide receivers who had noteworthy performances at the combine. So that, to me, shows that this young man really can take on the NFL if he wants to, if he puts the dedication and he puts the time and effort involved into it. I got this guy as a second-round guy for sure. Now, of course, I might be one of the few people who actually am very adamantly, advocating for this guy, saying that he's going to be one of the most explosive players in this year's draft class. But I'm totally sold on the kid. I think the potential, the ceiling, the bar that he could hit in the NFL is out of the roof. I'm not going to say he's going to become an all-pro receiver. He's going to become a Pro Bowl wide receiver. I'm saying that this young man could do a lot of great things if he gets under the coaching that he needs, and it gets under the guidance that he needs, more or less. But I'm a huge fan of Devante Walker. Hell or high water, I think he's the number 5 receiver in this year's draft class. I don't have him as a first-round guy. We're fixing to get into the first-round caliber receivers, but definitely second. And definitely his combine performance really boosted his stock so much so that I'm totally sold that he's a top 5 wide receiver. And I love the potential that this young man has and could achieve in the NFL. All right, so going forward here with our rankings list of our wide receivers, and now we're starting to get into the realm of the first round worthy, wide receivers. So you're sort of your top calibrated guys in this year's crop of guys, and obviously I think all 4 of these guys that we'll talk about are so necessarily, I think they're very neck and neck with their skill set and attributes and intangibles and everything that they bring to the table. I think all 4 of these guys can mold and translate into being number 1 perimeter outside receivers at the next level. And I got incredibly high grades on all 4 of them. So don't think it's a knock against any guy that, the one guy's 4 and one guy's 2, or, maybe one guy's 3 that should have been number 6 or number 7 on most people's boards. But, I think all 4 of these guys are first-round worthy guys, and I think even the top 2 guys are even top 5 overall prospects in the class. But none other than number 5, let's get right into it. It's Malik Neighbors out of LSU. Number 4, beg your pardon. Got my rankings wrong. Number 4, we got Malik Neighbors out of LSU. Now, obviously, had 2 back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons. I think there's very few in number at LSU, believe it or not, who have had back-to-back 1,000-yard receiving seasons at LSU. Now, this guy, like I said, he's an incredibly effective route runner. We had mentioned Brian Thomas Jr. with his uncanny ability to be able to control the middle of the field and be able to fling open on the post patterns, the crossing routes, and even a lot of go routes over there at LSU. And I can just remember so very well that so many just pure monster games where this guy just took over and just, sort of flashed and sort of showed people that he's the number 1 pass catcher in this offense and put some respect under his name. That was sort of his 2022 season in a nutshell, was, just solidifying himself as the number 1 option and just sort of, bolting himself ahead of everybody else on the depth chart. But I also remember this guy had I think he had like over 200 receiving yards against Mississippi State. Just absolutely just scorned Mississippi State. And, it was sort of a, shall we say, a statement game for the LSU offense that day. I do very vividly remember, because that was, ever since that game, they sort of just took off. They just unloaded on everybody else that they played the remainder of the season. The tape is really pretty solid for Malik Neighbors. Played really well against some of the best competition, going up against some of the best defenses and the defensive backs in the SEC. And now, of course, one of the biggest things about Malik Neighbors that we have uncertain information of, and one reason why, to be honest, I got him as my number 4 guy, is the fact we don't have a 40 time on Malik Neighbors. Now, he didn't do anything at the combine. Now, like I said, it's not all about the combine. It's also about the skill set and, what kind of a player is bringing to the table and, how much of an impact can he make on an NFL organization. And ultimately, Malik Neighbors could be a number 1 pass-catching wide receiver for an offense and really be a quarterback's best friend. But we don't know how fast he is. We don't know what his straight line speed is. We got a feeling it would be pretty relatively fast considering his teammate Brian Thomas Jr. ran into 4.3s. But he's got some really good in-game speed. And I think ultimately at the end of the day, that's something that a lot of teams say to themselves, well, as long as you have that capability, we're all fine and good from here. I think one of the true best, just straight vertical receivers in the class is what Malik Neighbors is. So you're getting a lot of great qualities and attributes with this young man, Malik Neighbors, who, like I said, by the way, was the number one pass catcher for Jaden Daniels, Heisman winner, and a relatively high quarterback in my rankings. If you want to go back and check that out with my quarterbacks. But yeah, Malik Neighbors, absolutely a first-round wide receiver. I would be just utterly shocked if he doesn't go in the top 15 in this year's draft class. But there are actually three guys I'm relatively higher on than Malik Neighbors. And like I said, it's ever so slightly. It's ever so slightly the slightest of margin between, there's a slight gap, just a very thin line that separates these four receivers, especially these three receivers. And I think a lot of people would be utterly shocked to know who my number three receiver is. But quite frankly, I'm not shocked. And that's none other than Oregon's wide receiver, Troy Franklin. And he cracks my top three as my number three guy in this year's class. And one thing you got to know about Troy Franklin, absolutely crisp, polished route runner. Just absolutely, there's really not a route in the book that Troy Franklin could not run. He was just an exceptionally fine route runner who was constantly getting ways open at Oregon and being just an absolute dynamite, electric playmaker on the outside perimeter for the Oregon Ducks. Like I said, another really outstanding perimeter, true downfield receiver that they were able to rely on a lot of times at the University of Oregon. And he's all around just a very, very elite playmaker. He's also I believe he ran I think his 40 time was somewhere around the range. We'll get the numbers right here. It was a 4.41, which was, I think it's pretty elite, obviously, speed for the NFL is, right there in the early 4.4s. And obviously, I love Troy Franklin. I don't think there's really nothing that there's no reason in the world Troy Franklin cannot be a team's number one vert receiver. I mean, you watch the film, you watch the tape, you look at his skill set. He's one of the best route runners in the entire class. I think maybe only two guys are better than him, which will be mentioned later. But he is just absolutely incredible, can go the vertical route, can do a lot of inside work. But I do think most of the consensus would tell you that the biggest knock you can throw against this young man is his hands, his true natural catching ability. And that has been something that I've heard a lot of fellow contemporary, scouting experts have said many times, is that this guy doesn't really have natural hands. I mean, how is he going to adjust to the NFL and going up against, these lockdown defense backs at the next level? But, I mean, look, at the end of the day, as long as you're finding separation, getting good release off the line of scrimmage, and showcasing the route running skill that Troy Franklin demonstrated timeless times at Oregon, by the way. You can watch the film. He's been a big-time contributor to their offense and, maybe one of the more unsung heroes of the offense, considering so many other guys stole the spotlight. But yeah, I love Troy Franklin. I love this guy's capability. I think, honestly, this will be a really hot take, as we do on Steve Money's Hot Take, is give out hot takes. But I think he's a top 10 player in the entire draft. And that might sound lunacy to a lot of people in the community, but I love this kid. There's not really a whole lot besides the hands. And I know that we had a receiver in last year's draft class named Quentin Johnston from TCU who came out, and there was a lot of, hard critique about his hands. I definitely didn't see a lot of body catches out of Troy Franklin like we did of Quentin Johnston last year from the draft. And no, I think Troy Franklin's going to be a guy that the more people doubt him, the more of an impact that he's going to leave on the league. So I'm not going to doubt him. I'm going to be a fan of his. I'm going to have him in my top three because I know what kind of player he is, one of the best route runners in the class. But I sort of hit the nail on the coffin, right? I said one of the best route runners in the class. You want to talk about the two best route runners in the class, and to me, it's not even close. Now, of course, I know a lot of people within the four guys I've mentioned, they sort of shuffle them in and out of the lineup for their top three or top four positions. But, man, I tell you, the top two receivers are top five players in the draft. And we talked about the quarterbacks and Drake May and Caleb Williams being both top five players overall in the class. I think it's the same case for the wide receivers. To make a case that this is an offensive top-heavy draft class. But number 2 is going to be Rome Odunze out of Washington. Pretty much the same thing I said for Troy Franklin. Smooth, polished route runner. Not really a whole lot of routes that he cannot execute in the running tree. He's, just perimeter ability, the inside ability, and everything else. But I tell you the one thing that's the more envious quality out of Rome Odunze is something that, a lot of people are saying that Troy Franklin was lackluster in, and that's the hands ability. I think the dude can make some of the best catches of any player in this year's class. I mean, his ability to reel the ball in tight spaces, right? Working against a defensive back who's probably draped all over him. Rome Odunze is the kind of guy that's kind of be able to out-leverage a guy and just be able to, snag a football no matter what. He literally has the build of an elite wide receiver. And I've heard a lot of comparisons to Rome Odunze to some of the greats of the NFL. Honestly, I don't think it's really melodramatic to say that this young man is going to turn into some of those great receivers that we have across the league. I got a top 5 grade on this guy. He won't probably go into top 5, considering, the need for quarterbacks for a lot of these teams are going to be scarcely hurried off the board. But I think beg your pardon, Rome Odunze, right? Some of the best hands in the class. We talked about guys like Javon Baker having some really good set of hands. But Rome Odunze, you just want to watch just some of the most incredible wide receiver highlight reels from any player in this year's draft class. It's literally Rome Odunze. This guy is a crazy, crazy good wide receiver who just, and yeah, he's another guy. He's a 4.4 guy at the combine. Maybe not the 4.3 speed that everybody was just so taken away by, but he has everything that any elite wide receiver would have to have built for him to be able to accomplish in the NFL. So Rome Odunze is a huge thumbs up for me, man. That's a home run, can't miss player right there. He could be a 1,000-yard receiver within no time. Like perhaps rookie season, he could already enter the chat of being one of the best receivers in the game. But there's one guy that's ahead of him who I think could take off sailing away as the best receiver or one of the best receivers in the game, and unanimously the best receiver in this year's draft class is Marvin Harrison Jr. out of Ohio State. Whom else was it going to be, really, people? He is the most, literally, of all my time evaluating receivers. I've been doing this for at least 4 or 5 years plus, maybe. He has to be probably the best wide receiving prospect I've ever seen. And I try not to make too many overly dramatic statements through this channel or through anything that gets uploaded, but when you watch the guy play, you just see just pure dominance in the game. Just purely just, elite route running skills, as we've mentioned, of so many of these wide receivers in this top range. The hands ability, right? The concentration on the catch from Marvin Harrison Jr. is absolutely impeccable as well. And his body and size and frame is absolutely just, wow, just dazzling for any team to be able to get their hands on this kid. Oh, by the way, he's the young offspring of Marvin Harrison Sr., who played for the Indianapolis Colts in the early 2000s. He's got it all. He's literally got it all. You can make the argument, firm argument, he's the best player in the draft. He's a home run, can't miss player. And I think he's going to be one of the more sudden, impactful players in the league. I have a hard time believing that this guy will not find ways of success in the National Football League, and probably immediate success if you really want to know the truth. Just like I said, his physical frame, his route running skills. I think, dude, honestly, his route running skills, not only are they the absolute best in this year's draft class of any player, they're some of the best I've ever seen. And one thing's for sure, the University of Ohio State has manufactured several elite wide receivers. Just to think of a few in recent memory, Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson won Offensive Rookie of the Year a couple of years ago. Marvin Harrison Jr. could, almost easily do the exact same. Whoever lands this guy is probably going to get themselves a Pro Bowl, possible All-Pro wide receiver out of this young man. There's really no flaws to the guy's game. The film is incredible. Like I said, the attributes, the intangibles are off the charts. He didn't do anything at the combine. It was a very mysterious combine for Marvin Harrison Jr., but it doesn't matter because as good as the young man is, it's not going to hold anything away from what his capability is in the NFL and how high that ceiling could be for Marvin Harrison Jr. and maybe perhaps wearing a gold jacket right next to his father, maybe one day in Canton, Ohio. Who knows, man? That's a bold statement, right? But you never know what could happen in the NFL. And one thing's for sure, we like to be bold. But anyways, thank you guys so much for tuning in to my top 10 receivers. I love this process going all the way to the draft, being able to talk prospects with you guys and just share me your thoughts and opinions. Who did I miss out on in this year's video? There's several guys you could probably that are worth mentioning. Let me know in the comment section, or let me know by getting in touch with me on social media or whatever you want to be able to hit me up by. Like I said, this is Steve Money's Take. You can find us here on YouTube. You can find us here on Spotify. You can find us all over the place. Anyways, thank you guys so much for listening. You guys have an awesome and peaceful rest of the day.